So I can show the work that I used, and let's just get this. I did. So get full screen. Yeah. Okay. So this is me at the Slade. During the period 1977 to 79, when I was a postgraduate student at the Slade, I wanted to try out media that I hadn't already had the chance to use. Thus, as well as performance, what I called arting at the time, moving around with folding sculptures and using video and closed circuit TV installations, which I hadn't had a chance to use, where I was at Bristol Polytechnic previously and learned traditional media. The video installation, this is a piece I called Clues, which was a kind of video game where I was the computer. That's more of that on my website. But another new medium I had the opportunity to begin to use was computer graphics programming. In principle, I was still pursuing the idea picked up from the artists like Sol LeWitt, Yoko Ono, Franz Erhard Walter, Kenneth Martin, and the Systems Art Group, like people like Gene Spencer and Malcolm Hughes, that work could be made systematically, following instructions or restrictions. Malcolm Hughes argued that the system used in making his work should be retrievable through analysis of the work, and I rather liked that principle. Initially, I used the shapes of my sculptures in the work and just took them, and these are perspective projected drawings of them done on a plotter. However, I wanted to get away from the geometrical aesthetic associated with constructivism and minimalism that I'd been exploring and felt locked into. Computer graphics came to the rescue because using vector graphics, which is what the plotter worked with, I could use straight lines to make curves. My grasp of computing through the whole period was rather limited compared to fellow student, say Paul Brown, but we shared a lot of ideas. In particular, I remember how we both experimented with anaglyphic plots to try and get three-dimensional imagery. I don't know whether Paul would remember that. Effectively, I had next to no idea how the computer worked at a fundamental level. So had real trouble getting my head around the ideas that Chris Briscoe and Julian Sullivan did their best to explain to me. Nevertheless, over time, I replaced shapes based on my sculptures with cross-hatching. And then, because I got the plotter to draw circles. Then I realized I could also get it to draw helices. And I got the system to vary the dimensions of the helices randomly. While learning how to program at the Slade, I was entertaining lots of ideas, amongst which were the relationship between play and art, as hypothesized by Ellen Dissanayake, and importantly, in the context of the discussion of AI in art, the location of authorship and audience participation in the realization of work. One of the ideas that I worked on was a space game that would automatically produce a comic after the game had been played, with highlights automatically chosen by the program. I felt that just as movies and animation have been the new art form of the 20th century, computer games, or an interactive form, something like them, would be the new art form of the 21st. As a teenager, I'd seen Edward Inatovich's Senster on BBC's Tomorrow's World. To me, it signaled the future, interactive art, but I had a long way to go. I gather Ed and some famous computer artists visited the Slade, but for whatever reasons, I didn't get to meet them. I did, however, spend a splendid afternoon with Ed Inatovich and his wife many years later when I was doing my PhD. The spacecraft in the program would move about in space, and if they got within range of each other, would fight, hence the zap shapes. When they saw what I was trying to do, Julian, I think it was, introduced me to at least one artificial intelligence technique but I didn't really start using it until it successfully in my art until 1984 to 85, when I was artist in residence at the University of Kent at Canterbury Computing Lab. That technique was the state transition table. I didn't manage to implement it at the Slade because I learnt about it late in the course, and as I had to focus on preparing my final show, the space game project was never finished. One of the most important things about being at Slade was that I mixed with students from stage design, life painting, filmmaking, photography, sound design, to name but a few. Also, the number of students, the subjects that the fellow students that we were doing in the experimental lab was really important. From people doing film, there were people like John Cass, who was doing wonderful work where he was consulting a map and then predicting what was going to be seen when he went out and took photographs. As well as fellow students, there were other artists. What was really important, who were using computers. Chris Crabtree would drop in occasionally from the printmaking department, later called John Crabtree. Peter Bales was a resident artist. Daryl Viner would occasionally drop by, and Chris Briscoe, of course, who taught me programming. All made work that had an enormous influence on me. This is one of Chris Crabtree's story pieces. And the idea of the computer could be used to simulate animal behavior, possibly human behavior, generating data that could then be used as a source of art, resonated with my interest in using human behavior in my work. Crabtree produced other prints where the creatures and features in the scene were represented by rectangular geometric patterns, but I haven't been able to find any examples of these. And this is a kind of storyboard. You can see these creatures moved across the screen. They consumed, across the print image. They consumed the vegetation. I think they might have got angry and attacked each other. I'm not absolutely sure, but it certainly inspired me. I love that stuff. When I recently approached Peter Bales for some examples of AI from the time he was at the Slade, he sent me these. And I'll go through a few. In an excerpt from his book, Simple Thoughts, which he recommended to me, he wrote, "The search programs are an early implementation of a virtual agency. 3 agents are positioned at random within a square field of action. A 4th item, at the time I thought of this as my remote presence within this small virtual universe, added by hand at some specific position. The goal of the algorithm is to localize the 4th item." So 3 points are at random, and then one that he placed itself, and they then had to trace, they had to find their way to where he pointed. The underpinning notion, as he said, is to collaborate. In the 3 agents have to collaborate in order to solve the problem successfully. They have to adapt collectively, given a history of consecutive individual actions, and are drawing issues spontaneously from agents tracing their respective trajectories, and are an example of a system documenting itself. Sometimes the search process displays a relatively affirmative outcome. Sometimes the process escalates into an endless search outside the field of action. We appreciate, he says, the consistent aesthetics of an unpredictable system, nevertheless operating in a coherent fashion. Now, Paul's going to talk about Chris Briscoe's work. I just want to mention that his work also influenced my later practice, and just how much you'll see for yourself when I show you a bit of that. Or if you know it already. As far as I know, Chris stopped making his fine art work when he set up shop with Paul to make commercial work at Digital Pictures, and built upon his CG anatomical modeling with Primal Pictures. Now, we've already seen a picture from Dominic, and Dominic was a fellow student at the same time as me and Paul. And what Dominic did was exploited the accuracy of the plotter to achieve his goals. In part, he explored the way that we perceive depth cues and figure ground perceptual phenomena. I'm going to show you images from an issue of Page in which he explained his work, but read extracts from a 1992 Leonardo article by Dominic titled The Conceptual Framework of My Computer-Assisted Drawings, Reflections on Physics, Buddhism, and Transactional Psychology. He explained that his technique was to use the pen plotter to draw an image in two stages. First, what he called a field of vertical lines, and we can see one here, and then a second drawing of a matrix of 25 groups of parallel lines. Superimposition, he wrote, of the matrix on the field causes a number of strange things to occur. Perhaps the most striking effect is that where the lines of the matrix coincide with those of the field, they merge and virtually disappear, leaving only a shadow caused by the extra density of ink and the slight blob formed at the beginning and end of each matrix line to betray their pleasant presence. Another prominent feature is the occurrence of interference patterns, which are different in each of the 25 groups forming the matrix. As Ernest has pointed out, sadly, Dominic Borum died recently. A link to his obituary can be found on the Computer Arts Society website. Whereas Dominic exploited the technology's accuracy, I wanted to make it less accurate, and I thought more human. Using a version of Randstack, the code that I showed earlier, I began to make drawings that I felt looked like calligraphy. To add some physical irregularity, and thus I hoped to sense that the image might have been drawn by hand, I used brush pens instead of mapping pens. In some respect, I consider this to be the most innovative thing I did while I was there. Like Dominic, I used overdrawing, but in my case, I was using a CMY color system rather than the standard colored inks being used by other artists. I tried to get accurate overlays, but also liked the effect of slight misalignment and that at a distance, the colors combined. Yet, if you looked closely, you could see the individual component colors. I did have my doubts about using the computer, though, thinking that perhaps I'd just been caught up in the excitement, and immediately after my time at the Slade, when I joined the architect Florian Beigel's research unit at the Poly of North London as a research assistant, I decided to suspend doing any of my own artwork for 3 years of the assistantship and see how I felt after that interval. After my time at Florian's architectural geometry research unit, I was unwaged for a couple of years, and then I was lucky enough to get a post as artist in residence at the computing laboratory of the University of Kent at Canterbury from 1984 to 85. This was when I initiated a 10-year project to explore the viability of interactive computer art, and where I got around to using the state transition table approach to design the behavior of species of agents that I called animals in the series of interactive behavioral programs that I eventually called Small World. So this was how I described the behavior of a species of agent. These were behaviors they could have. These were the conditions that they identified as each individual agent saw the other ones, and they had behaviors they could respond to. That's a larger scale, so you can see more of what's going on. After the residency, I applied to join Ernest Edmonds Research Centre, which I remembered Dominic had joined, in part so I could get funding and access to computer technology to continue the Small World project, but also so I could get a science qualification to balance my art ones. There, I was able to explore the aesthetics of interactive computer art, supervised by Ernest and artist researcher Dr. Susan Tebu, leading to the award of a PhD in 1991 for my thesis, Participatory Art and Computers, Identifying, Analyzing, and Composing the Characteristics of Participatory Art that Use Computer Technology. I also contributed little to the Centre's part in the ALVI Cooperative Machine Research Program, the results of which I think they're probably quite significant in the current discussion of AI in the computer-human interface. I still use Small World-like programs to make my work. The shapes are still generated by visualizing the movement of very simple agents with animal-like behaviors. And for quite a few years now, that's been bee-like behaviors, as if seeking sources of nectar and pollen together. It's worth pointing out I've retained an approach that reflects the vector-based aesthetic of my initial programmed work. When possible, I install computers in exhibitions so people can interact with the program directly. So I knew so little at the Slade about computers that I actually spelt computer with an O instead of an E, computor, which I think was because I was thinking of commutators, which I did know about. My point is that I was able to make very successful progress in my art, despite the fact that I thought if my program crashed, smoke would start pouring out of the back of the computer because I had no idea how it worked. So even if it's a black box, you can create some interesting work with it. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand you back. And I'm going to put some links on the chat if anyone's interested in finding out more.